everybody. Welcome to day 2. I hope you had a good group time this morning. So we're going to have a panel this morning. There will be question and answer towards the end. We'll have just sort of a dialogue in the beginning. But you can submit questions for the Q&A portion either on the Discord app, or there is paper in the back or paper in this corner here. And Nick is going to be realizing the relevance of the questions and filtering which ones make it through. But please submit some good questions for that. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite up Rod Dreher, Kale Zelden, and Elizabeth Oldfield for our morning panel. And I am stealing Kale's job because Kale is not moderating this discussion. He is a panelist on this discussion. This is mostly Hank, if you're out there. This is in just pure spite to Hank, who is making fun of Kale for not getting to be a panelist. So just to prove Hank wrong, if you see him, shove an elbow his way because he deserves it.
In full denim. In full denim.
In full denim.
Yeah. And a turquoise ring. Amazing.
Yeah, but no, I'm firmly on team khaki and boat shoes with Kale, representing New England and greater WASP diaspora fashion. So for the panel today, I thought I would just sort of kind of do this estuary style. We don't need to introduce yourselves. I think everyone is aware of who you are at this point. But I think I will invite the three of you to do a pitch of what is on your mind based off of the panel or the presentations that you saw yesterday, any interactions that you've had with the audience, or just sort of whatever's on your mind. And so we'll do a round where all three of you can pitch something that you want to talk about, and then we'll go around and do a point round. So John Van Donk, you see I'm doing it. Wherever you are, John, this is something close to the real estuary protocol. So no criticisms there. And then we'll have about an hour for free flow dialogue for all of you to interact. And then at some logical point, we'll switch to doing Q&A from the audience. So I will start over there with Kale.
Sure.
If you could give us a pitch of something.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about leading into the conference and listening to the speeches yesterday. I'm just going to make this short. We seem to all be dealing with the haunting specter of autonomy as the dominant driver of our social imaginary.
That's it?
Could you repeat that?
Sure. Come on, people.
Halfway down my tea. You have to give me a minute.
I had like 4.5 hours of sleep last night. Come on.
That's on you, bro.
Bourbon may or may not have been involved, Okay, so one of the through lines that I heard throughout the day is that part of this meaning crisis that we've been chewing on is what I'm calling the haunting specter of sort of the myth of autonomy as the dominating spirit of our social imaginary. And that specter of autonomy is largely unconscious, and yet we all feel its peculiar ratchet.
The spectre of autonomy as in the problem of autonomy or the allure of autonomy?
Kind of both.
Both?
It haunts us in sort of both senses of that. So that's my pitch, Sam.
All right, I'll pass it to Rod for his pitch.
Well, my pitch, and I have a story to tell later when we start talking, and there is a slide involved, but the thing, this has really come down hard on me here. I mean, this has been amazing. I've never been to an estuary event. I didn't know what to expect. It has far exceeded my expectations, because one of the reasons is it has made clear to me, the human shattering of the meaning crisis, but also it has been a catalyst to me to do more than just stand on the side and observe and talk about it, but to figure out what can I actually do to step out and act on it. So thank you for that, everybody. Now, it's almost a joke with me. I just made a joke to Paul about William of Ockham and nominalism, in the high Middle Ages. All of our problems come from that.
Hilarious.
And right, I know, it's kind of a joke. If all of our problems go back to the high Middle Ages, what can we really do about them? But to be concrete for a second, I think that one of the core problems of the meaning crisis is the implicit belief that all of us as modern people carry in our heads that there's no meaning beyond the mind, that there is the mind and outside dead matter. I believe, as a matter of metaphysical and religious conviction, that the world is sacramental, that meaning exists embedded intrinsically in all things, and it is our task not to impose meaning on the world, but to be able to receive the meaning that is already there when it is revealed. And this is really difficult. But what I'm thinking about this morning is the difficulty of getting people out of the nominalist mindset, which tells you that what I just said, that things outside of the self have meaning because we impose it on it. And that is so generally shared in modernity, people don't even realize it. It's the water in which we swim. And I think it's untrue. One of the great things that I've gotten from reading John Vervaeke is, and I'm a late discoverer of Dr. Vervaeke, is a cognitive, a scientific way, and Ian McGilchrist is the same way, a scientific way of realizing that the sacramental view of reality is actually true. It's not just true because it's a religious or metaphysical doctrine, it's true. So anyway, that's what is on my mind this morning, that how do we make find the courage or the ability or the willpower to make the leap from nominalism into a sacramental view of reality.
Wow. Okay, I'm an external processor, and this might not be coherent. So I'm going to grasp towards what I'm interested in, and maybe we will get somewhere. And it's risky. This is risky. I can feel this is my fight or flight, right? I can feel myself tensing up. It's a subject that's really difficult to talk about without quickly sliding into the ick, but it's something that both Rod and I write about, which is the erotic. And see, ick. Okay, we're backing off.
You're a married
Okay.
woman.
Right, let's rapidly bracket what I mean by that. We're not talking about genital contact. We're not actually talking about sexual intercourse in this expansive understanding of the erotic. And I know that Rod agrees with me because it's in his book and it's in my book, as there are many themes that we share in common of interest. And so, and maybe it's safer to talk about Hartmut Rosa's understanding of resonance. That when there is a moment of connection and encounter that can feel quite destabilizing, right? Because there's an aliveness to it and an energy to it, because it's not about sameness. And it is about the uncontrollability of the other and the unexpectedness of the other, which is why the particular marital form of the erotic is harder to sustain over many, many years, and you need to pay attention to that. But I think maybe one of the differences, I don't know Kale's thinking so well, but what I said yesterday about going out from the self to encounter the other, I think I place quite a high value on otherness and difference for our aliveness and our flourishing. That I don't think homophily is a necessarily bad thing. I think we all have it. I don't think we need to problematize it. It's not a good people and bad people thing. Like, the data shows we all have it, and it's all right. We can be relaxed about it. But that systems and structures and stories and meta-narratives and myths can sometimes reinforce it in ways that pull us back into ourselves and our tribes and our sameness. And I'm interested in yes, having those deep roots into my tradition and my faith and my family and my husband, and also going out from the self, as Buber and Lewis talk about, to encounter the other. There's a feminist philosopher who talks about the erotics of the city. There's something about living in a city, because it's constantly challenging you with difference and change, that helps us stay alive, right? That has that energy to it. So yeah, that interplay, I guess, between difference and sameness, about our ability to tolerate difference, or about our ability to maybe even like hunger for and move towards difference, and whether there's a slight different emphasis amongst us on how central that is to flourishing and aliveness and how we live together well.
All right. Kale, I'll bring it back to you to point at something that the other panelists said.
Well, since I'll point at Elizabeth, and by way of getting at it, I think it was Mary Harrington in one of her pieces talked about the sort of the great challenge of our time is to find a way in which men and women come back together again, both in the now, but the implications for the future. So that's what I'm seeing in Elizabeth's pitch.
Yeah. And Rod, I'll ask you to point.
Well, I think Kale is dead on with the problem and the challenge and the allure of autonomy. And it ties back to the whole nominalism thing, because if you accept a nominalist view of the world, that justifies your autonomy. It's like, I am the meaning-giving entity here, and I must maintain my ability to control what I find meaningful. The thing is, it's not true, and you will end up in a dark wood that way. But because, I like to quote Yuval Noah Harari. He talks about the turn in modernity, and he's very much a modernist. He said that around 500 years ago, we in the West exchanged meaning for power. What he's saying is that when we gave up the idea that there is meaning embedded in reality, that gave us power over the world. We could do whatever we wanted to with the material world because it was just stuff. And the allure of all that is that it does increase our autonomy and our agency. We can do whatever we want. The downside of that, and that's what we're living with now, is that we live in a world in which meaning has been evacuated. But in order to find meaning, we have to do what Gorchakov did in the movie, which is sacrifice that control, sacrifice that autonomy, and reach out in love for another. And it's going to cost us something. It cost him his life, but there's no other way out. To be able to step away from autonomy, as Kale was talking, that requires immense courage, because you not only have to go against yourself, you have to go against our entire cultural tradition of the last 500 years.
Let me
Yes.
be clear, I've got the protocol here.
Yes.
I say one or the other.
You point at what you like about what the other gentleman said.
Yeah, I think I'm also very interested in this question of autonomy and how it relates to freedom, and these twin, so I see these twin threads in my tradition between freedom and order, and it feels like so many of the theological wrestles are between those two things, and depending on our temperament and personality and when we sit on the big five and how we were parented and the culture we grew up on, we have a tendency to kind of emphasize one or the other, and I think that probably goes for the culture as well and plays out across the political compass. So yeah, I think I'd enjoy digging into that one.
All right, I will do my best to summarize better than any LLM that we're never ever going to touch or use ever would do. I'm hearing a lot about, what's the connection of William and Occam, the erotic and autonomous individuals? And if I were to try and thread that needle, I think it is, how do we really see other people as people? And have that be something that is not just imaginary but real, and what Nate Heil might call a personalist ontology or something like that, where where we recognize the fundamentality of personhood to all of being as a way that it's not just we're single people whose minds are chopping up this matter into whatever we want to chop it up into, but how do we really interact with people as other people? And so I will pass it back to you guys to have a free-form dialogue.
William of Ockham was a sexy beast. Let's just get that out. Not a metaphysical realist, but a sexy beast.
I am making no jokes about his name.
The last book I wrote, Living in Wonder, is based in part on something that Pope Benedict XVI said. He said that in the modern age, the way to reach people for the faith is not to talk propositionally. Propositional arguments don't really work for most people. The way to do it is through the beauty that comes out of the experience of the church and through the saints. And what he's really talking about is to have the teachings of the faith embodied in a way that can't be denied, as you could deny rationality. And it opens the door to the experience of the propositional truths. And I find that is what led me ultimately to become a Christian, beauty and the saints, an encounter with both. But I think it also has something to tell us about the problem of autonomy and the strandedness that we all feel in the dark wood. Most people can't argue their way out of this stuff, but you can open yourselves up to radical encounter and mystery that presents itself to you if you're prepared to give up control of, like, I can explain this, I can explain it away, but you don't know what's coming next. And Jess, do you have the slide there? Thank you. I want to tell you guys a story that I think will be helpful to our discussion here. This is one I could have included in yesterday's nostalgia story, but I just didn't have time, but I think it's important. In 2018, I was in Genoa, in Italy, on the last night of a book tour. I gave a lecture about the Benedict option to a packed church in that city, and everybody was leaving at the end. A man pushed forward through the crowd, an older man. He reached me, and he didn't have good English, but he said, I'm an artist. I'm a Catholic. I was praying in my studio this afternoon, and the Holy Spirit told me to come hear the American tonight, and give you this drawing I made. And that's what he gave me. I'm like, wow, that's beautiful. Who is this? Saint Galgano, never heard of him. But the guy couldn't tell me who he was. He didn't have the English to tell me who he was. But I thanked him for this beautiful image, and the title of which is The Temptation of Saint Galgano. And I went back to my hotel at the airport to fly home the next day. Well, that night I Googled, who is Saint Galgano? Galgano Guardati was a Tuscan lower nobleman of the 11th century who had been a violent man. His mother kept praying for him to return to the faith, but he wouldn't do it. He had a dream one night of St. Michael the Archangel telling him, put your sword down and come follow Christ. He ignored it. Shortly after that, he was riding his horse in the countryside. He heard the voice say the same thing. He ignored it. The horse started going up a hill, and against Galgano's will, when he got to the top of the hill was bare in real life, but he had a vision of a round brick church. Standing outside of it was Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and the 12 apostles. And the voice said again, put your sword down and follow Christ. Galgano said, it would be easier for me to take this sword and put it in this stone right here than to do as you say. He brought his sword down, and it went in almost up to the hilt. Instantly converted, lived the rest of his short life right there on the hill next to the sword and the stone. He became known as a wonder worker. People would come to him for prayer and would be healed. When he died, the bishop contacted Rome. They sent a team to investigate a cardinal. They interviewed Galgano's mother, his bishop, people who had been healed by his prayers. They canonized him in 1087, and the bishop built a church around the sword and the stone according to Galgano's vision. I said, wow, that's pretty cool. And then I Googled further. In the year 2000, Italian scientists went there to examine the sword and the stone. They tested the metal, and it is of 11th century make. They x-rayed the stone, and the blade is indeed down there. They can't explain it. I said, that's so cool. What does this have to do with me? I just took the beautiful drawing home and forgot about it. It was 2 years later when we were in the depths of COVID. I was at the end point of my marriage. I was so depressed that I went to confession one night. I had to get back to God in some way. I came home feeling so excited and so restored. Everyone was asleep. It was late at night. So I said, well, I've been watching Tarkovsky. I'll watch Nostalgia. And you know the story. I saw this movie. I said, this is me. This is me. And there was that incredible scene in the Abbey, in the ruined Abbey church, where it's a dream sequence where Gorchakov, St. Catherine of Siena said, God, why don't you show yourself to him? And God says, I am, but he can't see me. I said, yeah, that is totally me. When the movie was over, I Googled, where was that filmed? It was filmed in the Abbey of St. Galgano. I was like, that's the guy, that's the guy. And I ended up going to pray before the sword and the stone and just ask God for guidance. As it turns out, and I'll wrap the story up here, when I started writing the book Living in Wonder, which is about mystery and meaning in the world and how we can find it within the Christian tradition, I realized as I got near the end that the practical element of the book about what can we do to open ourselves to the presence of God in the world, it was all embedded in that image the man gave me, the core of the book, which is sacrifice, kneel down, sacrifice your will, make a sacrifice of it, keep your eyes on heaven, on God, which is what Galgano's doing here. And when the temptation comes out of your mind to tell you to take your focus off of the things of God and look to the earth, and it can be you notice the serpent doesn't have the head of a snake. He has a human face. You have to ignore that. Keep your focus on God. This is the ultimate meaning of the book. And the man, that stranger who was just obeying what he said the Holy Spirit told him, delivered it into my hands in a church in Genoa in 2018. So I dedicated the book Living in Wonder to this artist, Luca Dom, and to the memory of Andrei Tarkovsky. Now, I tell you that long story not to hog time here, but to say that this, for me, is a pretty radical example of how you've got to keep your eyes open and be open to meeting people. The stranger may approach you in a church in Genoa and give you the key, the map, to figuring out what's going on in your life and what you have to do. Because this mystery, it's embedded in things. I was talking to a guy here last night, a Protestant, who said he and his group of men from his church took the book Living in Wonder to on a weekend retreat, and they were all talking about it. And it talks about sacramentality. That's what the book is, and it's not always easy for Protestants to confront. But as they were in their introductory conversations, all of them had mystical experiences that brought them to faith, or they're deep in their faith, and they'd never talked about it before. So I think I want to offer this in the spirit of this general conversation, that we need to be able to talk about these things and not be afraid that people are going to laugh at us, because I really do believe that God or the divine speaks to us in ways that we maybe cut ourselves off from seeing because we've accepted a modernist epistemology or metaphysical framework, and also we cut ourselves off from talking about it out of fear of rejection or mockery.
That reminds me, Elizabeth, of what you were talking about yesterday in our seeming infinite need to signal to one another, and then therefore sometimes to not signal for fear of status management or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what is going on when those tender parts of ourselves are hidden. I've certainly felt both in my own life, and I think this is just hopefully growing up spiritually and growing up in age, but also a cultural change, a sense that I ran a religion think tank in the UK for a long time. I was a kind of public Christian that got wheeled out in settings that felt extremely secular. And the dominant sense was, well, you're a little bit thick, love, aren't you? You know? the number of new atheist men who tried to mansplain my faith to me. Thank you, sir. Oh, I didn't realize I was oppressed. I'm so grateful for you pointing that out. But that the becoming a, and I think you're right. I think this sense of like, whether it's our faith or whether it's something else, having sufficiently deep roots, having sufficiently a steady sense of self, that we can go out into the world and have a posture of seeking to see other people as they really are. That curiosity, that openness, rather than that craving, see me, right? Affirm me, acknowledge me, whatever it is. I think there's this paradox in the relational nature of reality, which is that we crave and we long for each other. We are made by each other. We are made for each other. Siri Hudspeth, was it Siri Hudspeth? Someone I was reading the other day talked about how for a baby, the mother's face is their first mirror, right? I think it's so beautiful that our very brain patterning is formed through the responsive relationship of caregiver and recipient. We need each other so deeply to know who we are. I think Hegel said, we see ourselves through seeing someone see us. And without, at least in my experience, some external seer, right, some external knower, that then leaves us incredibly vulnerable. Because humans are so fragile and failing, and they don't always see us, and they don't always acknowledge us, and they can wound us so deeply that without somewhere else to go to steady ourselves, to know ourselves beloved, it's really difficult then to go out into the world and not be seeking status, whether it's by seeming more religious than we are, or less religious than we are, or less weird than we are, or more left-wing than we are, or more right-wing than we are, or whatever it is, those tiny calculations we're always doing to find ourselves accepted. The freedom to just be at home in our own skin. And Tim Keller called it the freedom of self-forgetfulness, right? To be just interested in seeing the other, not really caring what's going on in us.
You know, you invoke the image of the infant and the mother, typically the caregiver fine, and they're real physical constraints. Like the baby can only see a very tight face, and it only as far as an arm away, and so we tend to think of those as physical constraints, right? And we hear constraint, in the sort of this myth of autonomy, but by the physical constraints, it also is the very thing which allows you to get precisely what you need, which is this radical attachment to mom. And so it's not so much a constraint, but it is the very sort of the beginning of a baby learning the embedded nature of knowledge itself. And of course, this is not cognitive, right? The baby's not sitting there thinking like, oh, that's my mom, and oh, she's the only thing that matters right now. But it creates an attachment, and we've had conversations throughout the weekend, problems with attachment, and that's. I wonder how we might consider problems of attachment, not understanding constraints in the opposite and generative way in which it operates.
Yeah, but bindings can imprison us, or they can hold us to the mast in a storm, right?
Right.
They are like most things.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in your question about autonomy and freedom. Like, what does it mean to be... Because I do think there is a radical liberatory impulse in the New Testament. I know that's not where everyone's grounding their way of being in the world, but it's where I'm trying to. But there's also the irreconcilable interdependence of humans. And I think of it as kind of freedom for each other, not freedom from each other. But could we think of the relationality as a form of binding that is a good form of binding that we should lean into rather than be constantly trying to cut off?
So yesterday in your talk, you you invoked words that have been drained of their, I forget exactly how you put it.
Semiotically
Their
evacuated.
semiotic evacuation of words. And I love that phrase. And I wonder if a word like freedom suffers from that kind of evacuation. And, Matthew Crawford in The World Beyond Your Head chooses to use the word agency rather than freedom as a way of maybe getting around some baggage, and words are words, or we kind of play with them here, but that he's going to argue that we craft an environment to maximize agency and flow and as an access toward meaning, so that it is not then reinscribing the myth of autonomy, but rather what he will say, something along the lines of, the only antidote to this myth of autonomy is one of heteronomy, and moving outside of freedom as license, maybe, but rather that you as the I can move outward toward not merely things, but thous.
All right, I'm going to step in a little bit. I'm going to do this. I feel like I was really excited to get Elizabeth and Rod some more time together, because I feel like you guys are a fun, spicy combination that has...
Don't go ick.
I'm not going to use the erotic
I'm no
word
William
or
Alloc.
anything. I'm
I'll
just
say
saying,
that.
I feel like, Rod, that story that you shared of the sword and the stone, about leaving yourself open to the stranger and leaving yourself open to what the Holy Spirit might be doing in strangers and other people around you, and not closing yourself off to that. I feel like one question that I think is really sort of in the air is, how should Europe and Western European countries, and America too, be interacting with the stranger, with immigrants, and with people? How do we see them as people, but how do we also think about the coherence of a country? And so I'm turning up the spiciness, because one of the things that estuary is for touchy-feely, vulnerable crying sometimes, which is great, and I hope that you've been in a group that's been able to do it. But another goal of estuary is to be the place where hard things can be discussed, but it's a conversation. And so I'm gonna tack away from touchy-feely towards a little bit of spice, if we don't mind.
Well, and we're both living through this. She
Yeah.
in the UK, me in Hungary, which both have very, very different approaches to migration.
Yeah, and Kale, you also can belong in this too. But yeah, all of the migrant crises of Rhode Island. Yeah. So
Get in here.
So this is my question: how should we properly interact with the cultural stranger, and what obligation do we have to them, and how do we think about this?
Do you want to go?
No.
All right, I'll go first.
I will, but you go.
One of the things that has really struck me, I've been living on the European continent the last 4 years, but my headspace, I live in America to a great extent by reading American media, interacting with Americans on social media, and it has just really startled me the extent to which Americans just don't know what's happening in Europe. It's not your fault, it's not our fault, it's just not reported in the media, and there is a massive and mounting crisis of the states all over in the UK and in Western Europe. It's a polyvalent crisis, but migration, the mass migration, uncontrolled migration, that's the neuralgic point of it. And J.D. Vance and Pope Francis got into a public spat about this sort of thing. Pope Francis, as you might recall, criticized the Trump administration's take on migration, said we as Christians have to be open to the stranger. J.D. pushed back by talking about the ordo amoris, the order of our loves. And he said, he's drawing on St. Augustine, said that we have a greater, well, of course we have to love the stranger, but we have a greater duty to love those closest to us. And the way I see the migration crisis in Europe is a lot of people in government, in media, and yes, in the church, have valorized the migrants as the other that allows us to offload our self-hatred, our anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. So the more of the other that we bring in, the better we feel about ourselves. And it's a very much a class thing, I think, because the people who pay the greatest price for mass migration are usually the working class, the poor, and others who get pushed aside, as in the UK for housing. And I mean, we can talk about particulars about migration, but the thing that strikes me is that these migrants are coming in mostly from the Islamic world, but not wholly. And when I see church leaders like Pope Francis saying, throw the doors open wide, I see what's happening there, and they are radically undermining the possibility of any kind of Christian civilization. Because Christianity is flat on its back, but in the Muslim migrants, whatever else you might say about them, they know who they are religiously, and they are not intending, by and large, not all, but by and large, they're not planning to integrate into a Christian or a post-Christian society. And so I think this is really problematic, and it's impossible to talk about because anyone who objects to it gets tagged by the media and the elites. It's racist, it's xenophobic, it's all the bad things. Meanwhile, the legitimacy of the state, especially in Britain right now, is being radically undermined by the elites, both the Tories and Labour and media and academia, by their demonizing any negative discussion of this. Meanwhile, the boats keep coming. And the government, neither the government nor the churches, et cetera, cultural institutions, will defend the borders, not just the literal borders, but the borders between civilizations. And if you're not willing to defend your own people and their right to live in peace and all of these things, even as you figure out what is our obligation to the migrants, they're going to lose everything. And I think that's what's happening now, that Europe and England and the UK are being swamped by sentimental humanitarianism, and those paying the greatest price for it are the working class, the rural people, and the poor. I take it you don't agree.
Not with all of it, no. Thanks, Sam.
I hope that, no. I don't know what kind of thanks that was, but...
No, I mean it. I mean it. So I want to do something that is probably not a super estuary thing, and I really want to say, for people in the room who are not Christians, is it okay if I just stop and pray? Not as a way of trying to impose what I believe on you, but because it's my best bet for how we're actually going to get to have something that's a conversation worth having, because I don't believe that debate is that useful. I really want to understand how we can be so similar on so many things and so different on this. So I'm just going to stop. Holy Spirit, who while we were yet far off and your enemies came towards us, would you give us wisdom and courage and commitment to each other's dignity as we try and talk about something that tends to raise the tension level in the room and put us into Lewis's first impulse to maintain and aggrandize ourselves. And I pray I wouldn't do that as I try and speak honestly in this space. In Jesus' name. So Sam and I were talking about this in the car because I find you one of the most confusing thinkers in the world.
I'm with you.
Yeah, me too. You are such an amazing writer. You're clearly lovely. And I read, my book came out last year, I read your book and I was like, this is weird. It's like 50% of the footnotes are the same. Our influence are so the same. That W.H. Auden quote is my Twitter bio, my Instagram bio. If I had another tattoo after a terrible experiment in my teens, it would be that we must love our crooked neighbor with all our crooked heart, right? You understand agape, you understand self-sacrificial love, I think you understand the gospel. And yet, the thing I see, and this is probably where I start sounding super evangelical, and that might be one of the differences, the Bible seems to me to be fairly clear on so I was reading this morning in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, like it's there in the law, it's there in the Hebrew Bible. You shall not have a different law between the native and the migrant. You shall love the native and the migrant the same because you were strangers. You shall love the stranger because you, the nation of Israel, were strangers. You know what it's like to flee for your life. You know what it's like to flee from slavery. And this is annoying me, and I'm not going to apologize for getting emotional because this is right hemispheric, intuitive ways of knowing that are important too. I believe our bodies are important, but it can sound like sentimental humanitarianism. But what I see is a Jesus who goes towards the most vulnerable and says, the Lord will put the nations in front of you. That's how the sheep and the goat starts. I've only just noticed it. They put the nations in front of you, and then he will separate the nations. The Greek's complicated here, but you can either say, put the people in front of you, or separate the people as in individuals. We don't believe in those. But the nations in front of you, and then separate the nations and say, I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a prisoner and you visited me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And I think you can get all kinds of political theology from the Bible. It's polyphonic, it's complicated. I don't have a really clear idea about migration policy, right? I'm not saying open the borders, let everyone in. I'm saying for the people who are currently in my sense, in the UK, the Iranian and the Chinese and the Syrian refugees in my church who can't walk down the street without racist abuse or being called a paedophile, for the asylum seekers who are living on £12 a day committing suicide because they can't feed their children, the way we talk about them, the tone and the posture that we have to the aliens and strangers in our midst, even as we try and work out these hard technical things, it grieves me, and I want to be committed to the full dignity and humanity of every human being, and I see in my tradition a widening, an opening to every tribe and tongue and nation on earth. And so my desire to say, native migrant, in, out, where you were born, is like the key criteria for what happens in your life. I worry about the way we're talking at the moment, even as we disagree around this, and that's all I have to say about that.
Well, I appreciate your vulnerability, because these things are really hard. They are. But when I was listening to you talk about the stranger and the neighbor, I thought about the thousands of young English working class girls in Rotherham in northern England who are pressed into rape gangs, and who, when their parents and others tried to go to the authorities, they were raped by Muslim Pakistani men systematically and put into basically sexual slavery and drug addiction, alcohol addiction. And when some of the people who advocated for them went to the authorities to say, you've got to help these girls, some of the policemen wrote them off as slags, as sluts, as whores, working class English whores. You don't see some of the people who advocate within the church for migrants, like, where was your compassion for these girls? And I'm not saying it has to be an either-or thing, but I'm saying that this is the inability to talk about this, because this whole story, as you well know, was more or less suppressed for a long time because it implicated so many people in the English establishment in both parties. And I think one reason that the discussion of this, and I deplore with you the demonization of everyone with brown skin, because there are people who are genuine asylum seekers. That's not what we're seeing getting off the boats and crossing the English Channel. We're seeing young men who are seeking economic opportunity or whatever, and I don't think they have a right to be there. And I don't think it's wrong for English people, I don't think it makes them a bad Christian, English people or French people or whoever, to say, no, you can't come in. You're not truly an asylum seeker. And I think also, you and I talked about this in the green room. I have a friend in Budapest, Catholic woman. She's short and thin and fragile. And she moved to Budapest 2 years ago from Paris. Hungary famously has strict migration policy. They don't have a lot of it. And part of that is because there are so few Hungarians in the world. There are 10 million people in that country. And if they lose their country, there's nowhere else. And this is why they're so tough. And they can also see how in Western Europe, cities that have lots of migrants also have a lot of criminality. They don't want that there. Well, my friend moved from Paris to Budapest 2 years ago. And I asked her, so why are you here? Yeah, we all love Budapest, but you're from Paris, and Paris is Paris. And she said, Rod, you can't imagine how much freedom I have being able to walk through this city any time of the day and even at night and not be sexually harassed by a migrant. And she's really a deeply religious Catholic, but she was just so terrified, and she told me stories about just daily life in Paris, how frightened she was all the time. And she feels in Hungary that she lives in a country where the government will defend the rights of people like her to walk on the street in safety. And I think that whenever we figure out migrant policy, government policy, I would like to see a government place more emphasis on protecting people like this vulnerable woman than on protecting young men of military age who are coming across the Mediterranean or the Channel in boats and demanding services and so forth.
So this feels like it gets into a really left hemispheric way of seeing the world to me. And I do it too. Like, I go between a lot of tribes, and there's all this demonization of young men, and it's just different young men, right? My progressive tribes are like, well, of course, the problem is young white men and toxic masculinity, and, you know, there are some huge challenges for young men, and not all of them are dealing with them well. I'm not saying there's nothing there, but the lumping together of young white men as like a problem group happens in some tribes. And then in other tribes, it's the young brown men, right, who are all coming because they just want to make money and probably they're sexual predators. And each individual particular human person in those groups gets elided. And I want us to be able to do the both and. I think part of the problem here is that we have such different news sources, right? Like we have been deliberately atomized on the internet. So the stories that I'm getting about, you know, migration data or what's actually happening or instances of sexual assault compared to kind of Twitter stuff about sexual assault will be really different from you. And we have no way of knowing, right? Probably the truth is somewhere in between. Probably there are like, so there's that. There's the we see different worlds and we're fed different stories, and I'm trying so hard to be aware of that in myself. Like, how do I go looking for the opposite perspective? It's one of the reasons I'm here, right? It's one of the reasons I read you. Like, how do I slightly challenge the bit of me that's like, I want to be continually reinforced in the story that I want to be true, right? Like, there are sexual assaults by young male migrants. I think that's true. I think they're small, and I think there are many, many people who are fleeing, sometimes war, sometimes just deep instability, sometimes authoritarian governments for a better life. And that's how America was founded, right? That doesn't seem to me to be like a morally reprehensible thing to do. I think I'd probably do it too. And so I don't know how we resist the impulse to go, all migrants saintly and wonderful, and we should protect them because they're all vulnerable. Or, well, of course, they're all slightly suspicious. And, of course, they're men, so they're all sexual predators. I don't know how to do this, but there's got to be a way of talking about it where it feels like a left-wing and a right-wing form of identity politics to me. And I'm suspicious of that.
Kale, thoughts?
Oh, good. Oh, good. Choose.
You have the autonomy.
Pick one, Kale.
So, it strikes me that Christianity proposes or embodies a strange tension. And I think, Tom Holland gets into this with Dominion, that you have notions of Christendom, and you have these notions of a kind of radical spirit of, that levels all things. And we see those visions throughout the scriptures of this sort of leveling. And one way to look at, sort of the history of Christendom is this attempt to balance these two seeming contradictions into some lived paradox. And, so you can kind of see the paradox right here. And engaging in the conversation with some kind of generosity to hear and to receive and to give is, I think, an important part. But I sometimes get the sense that we're arguing over a sandbox in which we are not entirely in control of. And so the frustration of the two positions are not so much with each other, but that those that have fabricated the social structure. And so when I hear Rod talk, he's giving voice to those who feel moved around on a chessboard, and somebody else, somebody, not necessarily an individual, but somebody has made a decision about winners and losers. And then I hear Elizabeth talk, and she's operating at such a local and personal level. Rod too, but yesterday we were talking a little bit about this topic, and you were living and worshiping with these young men who are not pedophiles.
Who are here because they got expelled for following Jesus.
Right.
And are brown-skinned and are in horrific circumstances in constant fear of being deported. And that's my homophily, right? I'm like, because they are also Christians, I feel a connection with these young men in a way that maybe I wouldn't if I hadn't encountered them in church, right? But it's made me understand how Muslim young men might also feel, right?
Right, and so
You're going to say I'm right.
guess this is the sidekick role, right? So you're talking, in worshiping with these young men who, again, the kind of generosity of spirit that you bring to the table as both a professing and practicing and trying Christian.
And failing.
Of course, all of us. But, that is part of your training. And so the reason why I wanted to sort of go up a level, that we feel on some level that we are stuck as mere playthings in a garden that is being tended by wolves.
Last summer I was in Budapest and met an American graduate student who had been living in Germany for a couple of years, in Frankfurt I think it was, and a friend of a friend, and we just went out for wine, and he had been in the city for about a week, and he said, I really love it here. He said, it's so different than it is in Germany. Like, what do you mean? He said, well, there's so much street life here. People go out all the time. They're sitting in cafes, they this, they that. Like, you don't have that in Germany? He said, you'd be surprised by how much migrant crime and the overwhelming number of migrants has driven Germans to stay at home or go into private spaces, avoid public life because they don't want to risk the possibility of a violent encounter because everybody has a story. And I hadn't thought about the meaning of migration and in that sense, that it makes the natives believe that, or many of them believe, that it's too risky to go out in public and have what they had before, a public life, because these strangers we've welcomed into our country are not being socialized and cannot be counted on to live in a civil way. And it's especially scary for women on the continent. And it's an anecdote, I know that, but it made me think about my French friend, the vulnerable French woman who moved to Budapest just because she wanted safety, which she had. We know people who come to Budapest from Western Europe. They've often heard, oh, Hungary's a fascist hellhole. They get here and like, this is not what I was told by The Guardian this country is. And after a couple of days, they're like, some of them have said, I've heard it with my own ears, this is what Europe was like 30 years ago, by which they mean it's safe and orderly before mass migration. And I think if one is going to argue in favor of mass migration, one has to account, one cannot just push aside people who miss what they had, who miss the orderly liberal societies that they had before a mass disordered migration. And I feel that there are some hardcore racists, skinhead types over there. I hate them. I do not want these people to flourish. But I think one reason they are beginning to flourish is because the powers that be in the media, elsewhere, the cultural gatekeepers have made an honest discussion of this particular very painful and difficult issue, have made an honest discussion impossible. I think David Frum, who is a liberal Republican commentator in Washington, he once wrote about migration situation in the U.S. He said, when the only people who criticize migration are called fascist, then you shouldn't be surprised when people start going over to the fascist side. Now, I don't think we yet have people actually going over to the fascist side, but I was telling Elizabeth, I was so shocked to go to an Ideas Festival in Hungary this summer and overhear a young Englishman say, I feel like fascism is the only thing that's going to solve what's wrong with the UK. I'm like, wait, what? I raised that issue with a mutual friend of Elizabeth's and mine, who's a conservative journalist in the UK. He said, you would be shocked by how often you hear that now. And he doesn't want fascism either, but this is being driven in part by deep, deep frustration over the seeming unwillingness of the government and the ruling class, by which I mean Labour, Tory, all of them, to get a hold of what's actually happening. Do you think that's fair, even that part?
Oh, absolutely. I have a lot of sympathy for people who are in rooted communities, who've had a thick local culture, who feel like there has been a thoughtless mismanagement of just plonking a high-need vulnerable population in their midst without the sufficient public services, without the schools, without the health service. I'd be flipping angry too. I just don't know if it's the fault of that particular group of people that have been plonked there. I think it's to Kale's thing. And when we're angry, I was reading Simone Weil this morning.
It's local.
Yeah, because we're interpersonal. But Simone Weil was talking about who the enemy actually is. And it is these bureaucratic, dehumanizing systems, not the other humans. And that... So this is I'm really aware I'm like, is this modernity coming out in me? But I used to be the director of a think tank. And I would be really interested in what are we actually, because you brought up sexual violence several times. It's not, I am a woman walking around London. My anecdotal response is if I have a man following me on a dark night, I feel scared no matter what color their skin is, right? I feel scared no matter what language they're speaking. I don't have a sense that women are more scared of brown men than white men. But I actually don't know in the data if there is what the correlation is. So you've provoked me now to go and do some research and not just go, I'm going to go to all the sources that I know I will agree with, but go, okay, what are we looking at here? Because these are narratives that we're telling, and people who are I don't know if I would even say I'm pro-migration. I don't know if I am. I'm pro-migrant because I'm pro-human, right? I don't have I want everyone to come in. I think it's entirely legitimate for a nation to carefully control its borders and manage its resources and and think carefully about how people live together. That I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with the reaction against the mismanagement of it, blowing back on people who it's not their fault. They're just trying to live their lives, and now often they're just terrified.
But where would you draw the line then? I mean, I'm asking you as a fellow Christian, if the government brought you in, Elizabeth, help us
Please don't do that.
Yeah.
The government, that would be a bad idea.
No, I'm just saying, how do we decide, no, you have to go back? Because there have been cases in the UK of judges saying, like, I think it was a guy, an illegal migrant from Albania. The judges ruled the government can't deport them from the UK to Albania because the migrant's son doesn't like the chicken nuggets in Albania. This was an actual case in the UK. I mean, clearly that's bonkers. No, it really happened. I saw the court ruling.
That is one. I mean, if that's true, that's madness.
Okay, yeah, but that's what I'm saying, though. It's things like that that turn people against the whole thing. So where would you draw the line? Presumably, you don't believe chicken nuggets are sufficient reason to
I don't know.
keep. But how do we decide?
So this, I think, comes back to, again, like living in different worlds and hearing different stories. Because I worked in Westminster for a long time. I've got friends who work in the Home Office. I've got friends who work in the refugee and asylum sector. And the story they tell is that it's almost impossible to get leave to remain. That people fight for years, living in terrible conditions, and have their applications knocked back and knocked back and knocked back and knocked back. We have a person in our church who, this is the thing with China, I need to keep it very vague. A person in our church who has extremely good reason to claim asylum from China. Horrifying. Repeatedly rejected. And again, I don't know the data, and this is not normally where I go. Let's go to the data.
But part of the incoherence, right? Again, talking about that upper layer, is that you're talking about a person who's actually trying to go through the system, right? Again, and yet, and this is true, I think, in a lot of countries, that those who get treated the worst are those who kind of try to work through the system, oftentimes, whereas those that just show up get fast-tracked in a sort of a strange sort of way.
Yeah, well, when I lived in Texas...
You have to show up in order to claim asylum. I don't really understand the distinction.
All right. I'll take my moderator's privilege to ask the first Q&A, and I'll keep it on this subject, and then probably for the Q&A we'll switch to whatever subjects bubble up from that. But I feel like, Kale, you mentioned earlier that one of the things that's happening is that men and women are finding it harder to get along. And that seems to be perhaps the most true in politics. Politics is polarizing. What's the easiest way to polarize the human population? Well, there just happens to be one trait that really divides groups 50-50. And I think that there's a temperamental thing. Like men, if someone is attacking your nation and you're a guy, you feel this thing in your gut, I'm going to round up my bros, we're going to grab some sharp things, and we're going to get rid of this threat. We're going to fight together, and if we need to die, we'll do that.
Like white blood cells.
Right. Like every guy has felt
I've got
that.
a pen down here. You can take it with you.
Right. And sometimes, honestly, as Christians, it can be hard to know what to do with that instinct. Like, I was 12 years old on September 11th when the planes hit the towers. But I felt that thing. All right, bros, what are we going to do about it? It's time. But then there's the other instinct, I feel like, that is more typical of the feminine temperament of, we need to take care of everybody, guys. Everyone needs food on their table. Everyone needs to belong. We need to, and though humanity can't exist without both of those things. And sometimes I feel like what's difficult as a Christian is that male instinct. You can see, you can read the book of Judges, and that's maybe a little bit of affirming of that. But,
it's not a manual.
But the New Testament is a little bit not as, when Peter jumps up with the sword and cuts off the guy's ear. Jesus doesn't say, good job, man, let's round out the bros and the sharp things. He heals the man, he heals the man's ear. And then, so there's the male-female dichotomy, and then there's the political personal dichotomy. There's the what should the policies of our country be, and there's the how should I behave as an individual. And I feel like those things get very conflated, and that we take what we want to be true at the political level and embody it at the personal level to try and win more people to our political team so that what we want to happen at the political level happens by our personal influence. And that it can
and vice versa,
yeah.
I'd say.
All right, go for it. All right, question is, what do you think of that?
No, I would say that, you're right about that, but it works both ways. The idea of taking the personal and accelerating it or enlarging it to national or state policy, right? And it just can't work that way. I mean, the fact that, and this is why it's so difficult to do analysis by anecdote, the stories Elizabeth is telling about the migrants in her church are very real. I believe them. The story that my Frenchman was telling, and she'll get into really scary detail about the time she's been threatened sexually, are also very real. And both stories, true stories, relate directly to, so what should the people in charge of policy, how should these stories affect the way they think about things? And these are both cases where, you know, if you reasoned only from the anecdote of the French woman or the anecdotes of Elizabeth, you would come to very different policies. So that can't be just that. But at the same time, I think what makes discussing these things so difficult is, and I blame the left mostly for this, it's because Elizabeth said in her talk yesterday that there's this deep impulse that in all of us to be right and good, and you react strongly against anything that threatens that. Well, I think this is one reason the discussion about not just migration, but about race and crime in the US and so forth, one reason why we have not been able to have honest, frank, forthright discussions about it is because the gatekeepers, anyone who challenges the official progressive narrative, is denounced not just as incorrect, but as evil. And there are real costs to be paid if you get on the wrong side of some of these issues. Costs to be paid in terms of your job, your public standing, maybe even get sent to jail in some countries. And so when the discourse, when the discussion only happens off stage, where you're only talking to people who agree with you, I'm talking about like a far-right person, everybody agrees with you, you don't have your priors examined, and you can't raise it in public to be challenged, because you could risk serious consequences. Then this is, I think, what aids radicalization, and it's just crazy. I mean, David Brooks wrote about this in the New York Times yesterday about far-right radicalism, and he talks about this very issue, how he's been in spaces. You know, he's a liberal Republican, whatever. Maybe he's a Democrat now, but he's been in elite public spaces, and he talks about how the progressives who controlled those spaces utterly demonize anyone who doesn't agree with them, especially men, white men. And they think that's normal. But David's point is that we, as David say, are radicalizing these guys because they just say, to hell with it. I don't care. If they hate me anyway, they think I'm a monster anyway, I might as well be a monster. That is a place we do not want to go, but that's where we are going. I'm routinely shocked. I'm an elderly guy. I'm 58, and when I hear people I know like Kale and others who are dealing with young people, I wrote a piece for the Free Press about this recently, based on coming to the U.S. and talking to friends who teach in colleges and high schools about the shocking rise of open anti-Semitism among young white males. And it's just they've been cut loose from any restraint. I think this is horrifying, and it's not going to end well for any of us. But how did we get there? And I think one way we got there is the sort of thing David Brooks was talking about, the demonization of anyone who goes against a certain narrative.
I completely agree. I think it's why these kind of spaces are so important, right? I feel really grateful to have been able to have a respectful conversation in embodied, where we're trying to listen to each other, right? And that was one of my greatest, I don't know where I sit on the map, post-liberal, blue, Labour, red, Tory, somewhere purple. And it was one of my greatest frustrations with the left is that purity instinct, that inability to listen to someone's reasoning or their story or where they've come from, but just going straight to name calling. And it drives mutual radicalization. And we're now in these death cycles of because we go straight to name calling, we can't really hear each other. And when we feel rejected, there's this deep instinct in us to harden in our positions, right? And you see it. It is a sociological phenomenon. And it is only when we stop and go, I wonder why they think that. I wonder how you got there. Please, could you help me understand how you got there? And I'm not going to call you names, and I'm not going to finger point. I'm going to seek to understand. And then often the other person feels so acknowledged and seen that they go, okay, now would you help me understand how you got that? And it's not that you have to come to agreement, but it's the only way anyone learns anything, right? It's the Socratic thing. It's the dialogos thing. That is how we actually grow. But our defensiveness and our name calling, I feel like we both took a risk today. You've been taking a risk speaking honestly for a long time. Like, I really felt in my body this moment of, there's a high chance that a bunch of people in this room who thought they liked me.
See, I don't labor under that illusion.
Oh, she's a woke snowflake.
Well,
and I'm like, because we had yesterday, I was like, okay, I'm going to trust this group. I'm going to trust that even the people who deeply disagree with me. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, you know, there was a line from your talk yesterday. I wrote it down because it really impacted me. You said, quote, "The most beautiful part of my tradition is to be able to say, I'm not right and good, but I am loved." And that is so key. You know, it
really helps.
So I want to jump in here because I love that, and you know that's a narrative, right? That you are trying to reinsert into this cacophony of conflicting and strange and awkward and warped narratives. And I read what you said today about Brooks, and you know, people like David Brooks are very much part of the narrative industrial complex. Right, and I don't mean that necessarily good, badly, but right. So
that's his job.
So, well, that was good. So, I think we pay much less attention to the narratives and the sources of narratives than we ought. In other words, you know, where do these radical young kids get their narratives from, for instance, right? So, you know, I always say this, I'm a high school teacher. And their narrative, you know, I made the joke this morning that I largely teach blank slates. And what I mean by that is that these are kids who have been completely severed from the narratives, the civilizational narratives, but they're not without narratives, right? So it was a little bit of a lie, I guess, right? They're blank slates relative to the sort of the stories that have formed us. That's scripture, that's the tradition, it's the old books that I always prattle on about. And where then are our kids getting their narratives from? And so if you look, you know, just as a thought experiment, you know, think of YouTube and think of TikTok. And as an experiment, I've gone on to TikTok a few times and sort of posted a couple of short videos just to sort of try the medium out. And I've scrolled through TikTok, and it is, as a 52-year-old man, just wild. It's just wild.
So loud.
It's very loud. And it's, you know, I found myself in mommy blogger space.
Okay.
Obviously.
Yeah, right, as one does. But, you know, in the sort of the lean-in, you go girl type stuff. And I've been on YouTube, and I've seen, you know, the kind of radical, more masculine tone thing on YouTube. And as we all sit looking like this, rather than all turning around and looking at that, there's this sort of the severing and the severing and the million little pieces that those little micro narratives then that are forming you in many ways unconsciously, you begin to think, well, that's just the scope of reality. You know, the kind of resentment that I'm seeing, you know, the peculiarities of young male resentment, the peculiarities of young female resentment are very real. But when you think that's the only thing, you have been confounded. You have had some sort of spell cast upon you by narrative formators who do not have your best interests at heart. And so what do they lack? They lack perspective. And as one of my heroes, C.S. Lewis, says, it's not that you have a burden to read great books, he will say. Good books, he says, not great, because I know that's sort of coded. Right? You have a burden to read good books, not because they're necessarily perfect unto themselves, but it's the only way that we can generate a perspective that scales both broadly and deeply, that scales both, into the past as a way of us, because he says the future doesn't exist, right? So then he will say that and so you have a burden to read good books because it's not that you will consume nothing, it's that you will consume bad things. And again, it's not moral exactly, not like bad, like, illicit material, but poor quality things. And so what I see with my students is that they are all very busy going down their respective rabbit holes in their respective interests.
Our own image reflected back at us.
Right. And so that, what's the word you said yesterday? Hyperphony? No.
Homophily.
Right. So, in that kind of homophonic way, then that is sort of cutting you off further and further. And so that kind of, again, so therefore autonomy, right? There's this weird lack of, or inability to sort of be culturally heteronomic.
All right, I'm going to transition to Q&A, but first off, let's give a round of applause for On a different subject, question for everybody. This is from McMo. Nobody likes fundamentalists. Is there a baby in the bathwater? Is there a steel man available to us through thinking the personal relationship with God/Christ? I'm gonna refrain from clarifying that last.
I love my fundamentalist friends, and one of the things I love about my fundamentalist friends is that they actually care about something.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentalist is often a swear word for Christians who are more to the right than I am, right? But I agree with Kale. I mean, I was just down in my hometown, Louisiana, and I met the new Catholic priest there, a really great guy who's doing a wonderful job attracting young people and stuff to the church, because the guy is like really enthusiastically Catholic, but he knows what he believes and why you should believe it too. But he's so open and friendly. He told me that his best friend in town was the Calvinist minister, around his age, who really knew why he was Calvinist. He said they loved having these serious debates about why Calvin is right or why the Catholic Church is right, but they would do it over beer, and it was done within a concept, it was a safe space of friendship and mutual love and respect, like the thing you were talking about. So what I don't like about quote-unquote fundamentalists is when they're like, I'm right and here's why you're wrong, and don't challenge me. But that you can find that sort of attitude among the most progressive people you know. I think that fundamentalism in the negative sense is believing that the full answers have already been given to us, and therefore the only thing you have to do is allow yourself to be beaten into submission. Now, I do think, though, that I've often been called a fundamentalist because I believe some things religiously are true and others are false. Now, there are ways to hold that position. You can hold it in a rigid, angry way and use your dogmatic conviction to beat people up, or you can use it as a sharpening stone for debate and understanding. And I think that and I've been around these people in the Orthodox Church and in the Catholic Church, if you use your conviction, your small o orthodoxy, as a weapon, then with no charity involved, then it can be really destructive. But if you deploy it with charity, true charity, not just sentimentality, but out of real concern for the person, you can bring them maybe over to your side, or maybe you can learn things that you didn't know otherwise. I mean, I won't go into the story now, but one of the reasons I try to be open is because I was so passionately, after 9/11, so passionately in favor of the Iraq War. I was in New York. I saw the South Tower fall. And I only realized 3 years after that disaster started to unfold that, in fact, I had been driven by vengeance. But I didn't know what was happening at the time. And I allowed my rage at the people who did this to our country to control what I thought was true. And anybody who said, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this, whether they were people like Pat Buchanan on the right or folks on the left, I'm like, well, they're either fools or cowards. People like me, we're the ones brave enough to know the truth and take the risk. And I was the fool. And I was a coward for not being willing to question my own priors. So this is why I try to hold on to what I really do believe is true, but to do it more lightly than I would have before, because I have been profoundly wrong at times when I thought I was profoundly right.
This is why we read him, right? He's a mind at work, and listening into someone honestly self-reflect is a precious thing. So yeah, for me, it's all about the fruit. Like, I have people who I deeply respect, who are, I think, amongst the most Christ-like people I know, who hold what other people would call fundamentalist beliefs, but they understand grace, right? So they're at home in their skin. They've got the deep roots and wide branches thing. They treat other people with dignity and respect, and they believe what they believe very strongly. And those are some of my favorite people in the world. And then I've got people who, in theory, are very open and relaxed and loads of space for nuance, but are going to really jump all over you if you say the wrong thing. So I think the posture to the other is not, we think it's linked to the beliefs, but I think it's much more linked to the character and the practice and the virtue and how much people are really, I would say, kind of getting their roots down into the gospel of grace.
Kale, go ahead.
Just real quick, I would counsel my fundamentalist friends to remember the poetry of the scriptures as much as they remember the law. And I'm not trying to win points here. Obviously, I teach poetry for a living, but but in other words, there is a tendency within the fundamentalist frame to really cleave to what we call sort of the left hemispheric. And I would encourage them within the safe confines of their own tradition to sort of broaden out and like get mad with David in the Psalms.
Next question is from Pick, or possibly PIK, or PIK. During the 60s and 70s, many intentional communities have come and gone. Why is it so difficult for intentional communities to persist across generations?
You can go next. He's written about it too. Because humans are annoying. Because of sin.
Because humans are annoying was her.
Because of humans are annoying. Because of sin. So there's a great book called, it's going to come back to me, there's a woman who did studies on 7 or 8 major communities that, Utopian Dreams is the other one, that were started in the 60s and 70s. And for all kinds of different reasons. The ones that were kind of utopian 1960s fell apart quite quick, because I think that vision of humans is like ultimately good, you just have to strip off all the laws and constraints, is a lie. And there was huge carnage from it. Of the ones that she studied, the one that has continued is the Bruderhof. And the Bruderhof is this, they're
Anabaptists.
Yeah, they're Anabaptists, and they are pacifist, and they fled Germany in the 1930s, and they have this quiet, clear, steady commitment to trying to love each other as Christ loved us. And I'm sure that they're also humans and annoying and full of sin, so they will be riddled with dysfunction, like every other community and institution and church. But they have endured. And I think we live in community as non-utopians because we're incredibly aware of how difficult it is to love each other as Christ loved us, how real a thing our tendency to disconnection is. And so we're trying to draw on those more rigorous approaches to intentional community that start with that, right? The rule of St. Benedict is very pragmatic.
I've heard of it.
It's really great. I'll send you a copy. I think without that kind of rigorous, really quite structured, hard-headed, non-utopian planning and attention, it's really, really hard for things to go on. But also not everything's meant to last forever, right? There are different seasons, and there's a Jack Gilbert poem about Icarus that says, you know, was Icarus just coming to the end of his triumph? Just because, you know, before he fell, he flew. And we try and think about that. Our community's unlikely to last forever, but we hope while we're there, we might grow in our ability to love each other and love God and love our neighbor for as long as it's healthy. Do you want to say something?
No.
What in feminism do you feel is valuable to carry forward? Is there a sacred in feminism, a baby in the bathwater?
Sacred in feminism.
What in feminism do you feel is valuable to carry forward? Is there a sacred in feminism? So I believe, in feminism, is there anything that's sacred? And is there a baby in the bathwater of feminism?
See. Kale?
Where's Mary Harrington when you need her?
What do the mommy bloggers think of this question, Kale?
What does what?
What do the mommy bloggers have to say about it?
Yeah. Man, if you look at sort of pop feminism, that you might see on a TikTok, for instance, just listen to it for a few minutes. You'll see like 20 videos. Thank you. But if feminism is a permission structure for resentment, it's poison. And much of what I see is poison. And one of the reasons why I like Mary's work, Mary Harrington's work, is that she's trying to disambiguate the good from the bad in a good faith way, and in a really smart way because she's brilliant. Is there, because that's where she winds up with her question, can men and women get along? It's not a new question, but insofar as feminism helps us answer that question, I'm for it. But much of what I see in the popular imaginary is a lie. It is a bad jig. It is a bad nudge. And it's hard for me, I have 2 daughters myself, and of course I want what's best for them. But it's hard for me to see in modern instantiations of popular feminism something that will ultimately lead them to flourishing. And so I struggle with the feminism question, not because, of I try
you
really...
hate women, Kale.
Right. But I struggle with it because I've seen the warped job that it has done on many of my friends, my contemporaries, and I've seen some of my friends who have pushed back against the sort of the narratives of feminism and have lived flourishing lives with husbands who love, adore, and honor them. But I also know many instances in which women have gotten destroyed. And so it's a tough thing for me. I'm against feminism. Well, okay, which one, how much, etc. But I really worry about pop feminism. I guess that's where I would land.
Yeah, I'm pretty much where Kale is. But, my own thinking about feminism has been conditioned by talking to people of my mother's generation and those older about what life was like before feminism. Just before we came up here, Kale and I and someone else were talking about Catholic traditionalists who react against the Second Vatican Council. And they have often so angry at it and think everything, all the bad that what goes on in the Catholic Church today is because of that event in the 1960s. And I said the question I had, even when I was a Catholic, and I still do, is if things were so great before the council, why did they fall apart so radically? And I think a similar analysis can be brought to feminism, that if things were so great for women before feminism, why did it take off as it did? I think the answer is things weren't great for feminism, for women back then. And so I think feminism, as in a very general sense, was a necessary corrective to, I mean, we've all watched Mad Men, right? I mean, that world was there. I saw the small town version of it when I was very young, because feminism didn't get to my town till the 70s. But so there's truth in that. But of course, there's been a lot of throwing out a whole orphanage full of babies with that bathwater, and that's why I'm with Kale. Nevertheless, I think that there is a fundamental truth there, that we had a society before that devalued women and asked things of them and compelled them to accept things that they shouldn't accept. And as the father of 2 sons and a daughter, I'm glad for what the early feminists did, but it is becoming a license for destruction and hatred.
Thank you.
Have I explained this to you?
Could you just say more? I don't fully understand. No. So I very happily call myself a feminist. I think a lot of the things that we perceive as toxic and challenging in feminism are about individualism.
What?
Individualism. Yes. What I long for is a communitarian feminism. I long for a feminism that takes seriously our interdependence, that takes seriously the non-zero-sum nature of human life, right? That can say yes to the flourishing of men and yes to the flourishing of women, and have that not sound like a contradiction, right? I agree, I do think feminism, if what we mean by it is equality and dignity and freedom for women to navigate their own lives according to their own conscience, I don't think many people in this room would argue that we shouldn't have that. Right. But you're exactly right, and we see this in some conversations around masculinity as well, right? There are reasons for men to feel frustrated about some of the ways society is structured, and some of those conversations can be an excuse for resentment and for blaming a whole other half of the population. And feminism does it too. We say, gosh, we haven't really figured out how to flourish together despite our differences. It's all men's fault. And so that desire to go, one, it's zero-sum, it's either or, not both and this, I think, faulty anthropology that we are individuals who can flourish apart from our relationships with each other. When feminism looks unhealthy, I think it's not necessarily the feminist part, it's those dynamics that show up in all kinds of places.
You know, your words make me think about something I'm hearing about the Orthodox Church in the United States. Again, I live overseas, so I'm not seeing this personally, but friends are dealing with it. They say that so many young men are finding their way into Orthodoxy. And I can see why, because one thing that really struck me when I became Orthodox 20 years ago was how masculine the religion is, but not macho, not at all. And that's an important difference, because so many of these young men, I'm told, are showing up in the Orthodox Church having been red-pilled by ortho bros, and they think that it's going to be a masculinist place, and they're having to be deprogrammed. It's like, no, we're not here to be, plant the stake and that's not what Orthodox Christianity is. It's masculine without being macho. And I think that, I like that distinction, but I would also find nurture in spaces and institutions that are female without being feminist. Does that make sense? They haven't made an ideology of gender identity or sex identity and are not using it as a weapon, but rather, as you say, to nurture what is true and what is in the nature both of the institution and of the individuals in there, to lead them to flourish according to their nature. And men and women are very different. You just are. That's just how we were made.
Yeah, I always come, and you spoke about it so beautifully yesterday, the kind of the agape, self-sacrificial. There's been a lot of controversy in the UK at the moment about xenophobia, and I think what I see in the best in the New Testament and is xenophilia. Like if our posture can be, how can I liberate you? How can I love you? How can I seek your good? and we are communities where we're doing that for each other, everyone gets their needs met. And we have each other's backs, and we are paying attention to each other. It's that Lewis's first impulse of the aggrandize and maintain ourselves, because we don't believe anyone else is going to have our back. We don't believe anyone else is going to protect us. Of course we're going to feel like we need to protect and fight for ourselves or our group.
All right, I think I'm going to be mindful of time. I think we're going to bring that to a close right now. Next up, we have estuary groups. And then at 12:30, we have lunch. And then after lunch, we've got a great agenda for you this afternoon. So let's give one more round of applause for all of our panelists.